Okay, so I'm still on my trip in Arizona, and I'm just below the Catalina mountain range outside of Tucson, sort of on the eastern, maybe northeastern side of Tucson. And I spent the morning going to the biosphere, which is now managed by Arizona State University. And I drove up to Tempe and I poked around a lot of different departments, from the blockchain labs to the civic innovation labs to the global future sustainability labs to the bioengineering biodesign labs. And I've done that the last couple of days. So today I'm doing the biosphere, and I thought, as I drove by, there's the state park. And so I thought, well, it's actually been raining the last 2 days. You can probably see the clouds behind me, which is kind of unusual. So everything smells so good, and it feels like a gift to be able to be here during the couple of days of rain. But it let up enough for me to start my reading of We, and this seemed like a pretty auspicious location because the biosphere is this containment zone of life in this sort of attempt at terraforming, I guess, or figuring out about space colonization or something like that. And, it actually feels a bit nonsensical because when you go inside, none of the plants look terribly happy to be there. And I think the people who ended up being part of that experiment, it went wrong in many, many ways, including them not having enough food or oxygen and not getting along with each other. So as a bit of an offset for that, I decided to come in and sort of reconnect with the natural spaces, free-range nature. And this is Catalina State Park. And I'm sitting here on a rock that was part of an excavated wall of the Hohokam tribal people. I think 1150 AD, they anticipate that this wall was built, and it was maybe 5 feet high for protective purposes. And then at some point in the mid-19th century, it was the land was taken over by a rancher, Romero, I think was the name. And but most of it's gone back to nature. There was actually a wildfire here within the past year, so maybe at some point I'll include a photo. There was this tremendous saguaro cactus that has sort of imploded as part of the fire. I wasn't really sure how they burned. I mean, I'm an East Coaster, so I don't know how all of this works. But it was quite something to see just the scale of it. And it had dropped its arms in the 3 different directions, and then just the structure, quite amazing and beautiful. And so adapted to this environment. So I think I'm gonna read the introduction to We, at least here. Hopefully the rain holds out. If it doesn't, I'm here with my iPhone, so I'm gonna have to turn that off and move along with the day. Tomorrow is actually my birthday, and I'm gonna be going down to the Titan missile silo. That's how I'm gonna celebrate my birthday, is touring the remnants of the Cold War and reflecting on how the Cold War enabled the prison planet ruled from space, and life ruled by keyhole, that sort of thing. And then hopefully I'll be able to swing by the airport on the way back and put an intention out at the aerospace defense contracting, at least one of those spots. So I'm going to start with the introduction. This is called We. I've mentioned it before. It's Yevgeny Zamyatin. I'm going to say it might be a little bit dry reading, but it's important because essentially this is a world. He wrote this in 1921, and it's imagining a world made out of math, and a world of like total cybernetic control. And I keep trying to sort of offer these 2 views. One is the Julian Huxley view that man is the sole trustee of evolution on the planet, and it's our job to hurry it up. And that would be in line with those Mormon transhumanists who are like, God's given us some technology and he's waiting for us to raise the dead, I guess. And on the other hand, a more indigenous nature-based reflection where we're relatives seeking harmony, but in a more intuitive way than a mechanical way, and something I sort of continue to frame it as sacred and profane. Some people might argue with me, people who are engineers, but anyway. I'm going to get started here. We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Let's see. This English language version is 1972, but I'm pretty sure it was 1921 was the very first printing. He was Russian, I believe. Introduction. We played a fateful role in Yevgeny Zamyatin's life. An epitome of his philosophy, the novel prefigured his own future and that of his country with astonishing accuracy. Zamyatin's credo is best expressed in the words of the heroine of We: "There is no final revolution. Revolutions are infinite." You know what? I'm going to hold that thought. I'm going to see if I can figure out a way to cover my phone with a Ziploc so it doesn't get ruined. Let's see if you can still see me if I put the bag on. It's not great, I guess. See how we can try this. Maybe that's good enough. Keep it dry. Oh. Let's see how that works. I'm gonna have to stop the camera and just go. All right, well, I made the loop around and it stopped for a little bit, so I'm gonna try this again. We'll read as long as we can, and then I'll stop, and when I go back, I'll do some more audio tonight. Okay, so need to wipe off my glasses. Okay, so We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, take 2, introduction. We played a fateful role in Yevgeny Zamyatin's life. An epitome of his philosophy, the novel prefigured his own future and that of his country with astonishing accuracy. Zamyatin's credo is best expressed in the words of the heroine of We, quote, "There is no final revolution. Revolutions are infinite." And, quote, "I do not want anyone to want for me. I want to want for myself." These 2 principles, eternal change and freedom of the individual to choose, to want, to create according to his own need and his own will, dominated both his life and his work. "We shall break down all walls to let the green wind blow free from end to end across the earth," says his heroine. Small wonder he was hated and hounded by those who demanded uniformity and total compliance with the outside will, the states, the benefactors, the parties. A powerful and original writer, and an entirely modern one, Zamyatin is deeply rooted in the traditions of Russian literature. He is a direct descendant of Gogol and Dostoevsky, the favorites of his childhood. He is also close kin to Leskov, Chekhov, Shchedrin, and his own contemporaries Alexei Remezov and Andrei Bailey. Like Gogol and Dostoevsky, he is profoundly concerned with central moral problems. Like all of them, he is a great master of satire, style, and the grotesque. Zamyatin was born in 1884 in Lebedyan, one of the most colorful towns in the heart of the Russian Black Earth Belt, some 200 miles southeast of Moscow, a region of fertile fields, of ancient churches and monasteries, of country fairs, gypsies and swindlers, nuns and innkeepers, buxom Russian beauties and merchants who made and lost millions overnight. It was also a region that preserved a richly expressive folk speech, which Zamyatin absorbed and later used to magnificent effect in many of his stories, plays, and novellas. His father, an Orthodox priest, taught religion at the local school. His mother was a talented pianist. A naval engineer by training, Zamyatin early turned to literature. In 1913, he published the novella A Provincial Tale, and in 1914, At the World's End, satirizing army life in a remote garrison town. The journal in which the latter appeared was confiscated by the Tsarist authorities, and both the editor and the author were brought to trial for maligning the Russian officer corps. The charges were dismissed, but this was only one of Zamyatin's lifelong clashes with constituted authority. As a student at the St. Petersburg Polytechnical Institute during the early years of the century, Zamyatin had joined the Bolshevik faction of the Social Democratic Party. Arrested during the Revolution of 1905, he spent some months in solitary confinement, and on his release was exiled from St. Petersburg. After a short stay in Lebedyan, he came back to the capital where he lived, quote unquote, illegally, and even continued his schooling until 1911, when the police finally caught up with him and exiled him a second time. It was during this exile that he wrote A Provincial Tale. In 1913, he was amnestied and permitted to reside in St. Petersburg. On graduation from the Polytechnic Institute, he was invited to serve on its faculty. For some years, teaching literature was largely superseded by teaching and engineering work. During World War I, Zamyatin was sent to England to design and supervise the construction of some of the earliest Russian icebreakers. When the Revolution of 1917 broke out, he could not endure to be away from Russia and hastened back, bringing with him two tales satirizing English life, The Islanders and The Fisher of Men. In Russia, Zamyatin, no longer a Bolshevik, threw himself with tremendous energy into the great cultural and artistic upsurge that followed the revolution. This was a period of fantastic contradictions. Russia lay in ruins after years of war, revolution, and continuing civil strife. Her economic life had all but wholly broken down. Transportation, communication, the food supply, the contact between city and village were in total disarray. Yet, in the midst of hunger and cold, a band of dedicated spirits took it upon themselves not only to save the country's culture, but to present to the hitherto deprived masses the cultural heritage of the entire world. Initiated chiefly by Gorky, the veritable patron saint of Russian literature in those grim days, a number of organizations were formed, both to keep writers, scholars, and artists physically alive, and to permit them to continue their work. In St. Petersburg, these included the House of Arts, established in 1920 in the unheated former palace of the great merchant Yeliseyev, where writers were given lodgings in every available room and cubbyhole, the House of Scientists, and a number of publishing houses and literary journals. Zamyatin served on the editorial boards of several of these. Studios were organized where young writers were taught the elements of their craft by such writers, poets, and translators as Zamyatin, Gumilyov, Lozinsky, Chukovsky, and others. Both teachers and students often had to cross the frozen city on foot and sit in unheated rooms, dressed in old coats, sweaters, mufflers, chilled and hungry, but totally absorbed by the brilliant discussions of literature. A variety of schools and movements proliferated in all the arts, some of them continuing with renewed vigor from pre-war days, others entirely new. Endless disputes raged between symbolists, futurists, constructivists, formalists, aimsists, imaginists, neo-realists, and of course the increasingly powerful and vocal group of proletarian writers and critics who regarded literature as the mere instrument of the revolution and social change. Zamyatin became the leader and the teacher of the Serapion Brethren, a group that included some of the most promising and original young writers of the time: Mikhail Zovchenko, Vsevolod Ivanov, Valentin Katayev, Veniamin Kavarin, Konstantin Fedin, Lev Luntz, Nikolai Tikhonov, Viktor Shokolovsky, and others. Differing in temperament, method, and scope, they were united in their insistence on creative freedom, on the artist's right to pursue his individual vision, on variety, experimentation and form, and the importance of craft. Lev Luntz, one of the most brilliant members of the group, formulated a manifesto in which he proclaimed the complete autonomy of art. Literary chimeras, he wrote, are a special form of reality. He rejected those on both right and left who cried, "If you are not with us, you are against us." Quote, "With whom are we, the Serapion Brethren?" he asked. "We are with the hermit Serapion. We reject utilitarianism. We do not write for the sake of propaganda. Art is as real as life itself, and as life itself, it has no goal or meaning. It exists because it must exist. Our one demand is that the writer's voice must never be false." The Serapions rallied around Zamyatin's credo that, quote, "true literature can exist only where it is created, not by diligent and trustworthy officials, but madmen, hermits, heretics, dreamers, rebels, and skeptics," a credo he proclaimed in 1921 in his essay, "I Am Afraid." And the need for heresy, the right to say no to official dogma, the belief that mistakes are more useful than truths, that truths are ideas, quote, already afflicted with arteriosclerosis, are urged again and again in Zamyatin's writing. In Tomorrow, he wrote, "He who has found his ideal today is like Lot's wife. already turned into a pillar of salt. The world is kept alive only by heretics. The heretic Christ, the heretic Copernicus, the heretic Tolstoy. Our symbol of faith is heresy. We call the Russian intelligentsia to the defense of man and of human values. We appeal not to those who reject today in the name of a return to yesterday, not to those who are hopelessly deafened by today. We appeal to those who see the distant tomorrow and judge today in the name of tomorrow, in the name of man. In 1921, in an essay entitled Paradise, Zamyatin again lashed out scathingly at the purveyors of unanimity, at those who pressed for total conformity. Much has been said by many about the imperfection of the universe, its astonishing lack of monism, water and fire, mountains and abyss, saints and sinners. What absolute simplicity, what happiness, what unclouded by any thought there would have been if God had from the very first created a single fire water, if he had from the very first spared man the savage state of freedom. We are unquestionably living in a cosmic era, an era of creation of a new heaven and a new earth. And naturally, we will not repeat his mistake. There shall be no more polyphony or dissonance. There shall be only majestic, monumental, all-encompassing unanimity. In the New Russian Prose, 1923, he wrote, "Life itself today has lost its plain reality, plane. It is projected not along the old fixed points, but along the dynamic coordinates of Einstein, of revolution. In this new projection, the best-known formulas and objects become displaced, fantastic, familiar, unfamiliar. This is why it is so logical for literature today to be drawn to the fantastic plot, or to an amalgam of reality and fantasy." And in his essay on literature, revolution, entropy, and other matters, he developed further one of the central ideas of we. Revolution is everywhere, in everything, is infinite. There's no final revolution, no final number. The social revolution is only one of an infinite number of numbers. The law of revolution is not a social law, but an immeasurably greater one, is a cosmic universal law, like the laws of the conservation of energy and on the dissipation of energy, entropy. In the same essay he wrote, "Harmful literature is more useful than useful literature, for it is antientropic. It is a means of combating calcification. It is utopian, absurd. It is right 150 years later." And one of his most significant statements, "What we need in literature today are vast philosophic horizons. We need the most ultimate, the most fearsome, the most fearless. Why and what next?" In 1926, the goal, Zamyatin made a frontal attack on the communist critics who demanded of the writer total subservience to the demands of the party. In 1926, the revolution does not need dogs who sit up in the expectation of a handout or because they fear the whip. Nor does it need trainers of such dogs. It needs writers who fear nothing. It needs writers in whom the revolution awakens a true organic echo. And it does not matter if this echo is individual, if a writer ignores such and such a paragraph, adopted at such and such a conference. What matters is that his work be sincere and that it lead the reader forward, that it disturb the reader rather than reassure and lull his mind. But where forward, and how far forward? The farther the better. Reduction of prices, better sanitation in the cities, all this is very good. I can imagine an excellent newspaper article on these topics, an article that will be forgotten the next day. But I find it difficult to imagine a work by Lev Tolstoy or Romain Rolland based on improvement of sanitation. Inevitably, Zamyatin became one of the prime victims of the purveyor of unanimity and sanitary literature. He was attacked for inconsonance with revolution, for vilification and slander of revolutionary tenets and achievements, for being a cold and hostile observer, an internal emigre who played into the hands of the enemies of the Soviet regime. It is scarcely necessary to point out here to the long list of independent artists, Akhmatova, Zoschenko, Pasternak, Brodsky, Solzhenitsyn, and others who have suffered similar treatment in the hands of dictatorship. During the first post-revolutionary decade, it was still possible for Zamyatin to publish his works despite the constant chorus of abuse from the guardians of orthodoxy. His works naturally never appeared in the official, sponsored, subsidized magazines. They were usually published in fairly short-lived journals or anthologies issued by the writers' groups, or by the few private journals and publishing houses that were still allowed to exist in those early years. With great courage and integrity, Zamyatin continued to write as he saw and felt, essays, plays, fiction, although the dead hand of the dictatorship was steadily becoming heavier. A striking light on an important facet of his character is thrown by a passage from an essay on the future of the theater, written considerably later and published in French in 1932. Quote, "The most serious play he wrote is the play which carries in its pocket a timetable drawn up and stamped a long time ago, and marking the day and hour of the tragic end of every one of us." Unquestionably, he knew what was to come, but he went on doing what he felt he must do. The scope and quality of his writing under the circumstances are astonishing. Zamyatin was not only a consummate satirist and stylist, but a matter of many themes and many styles. Some of his stories are marvelous evocations of the almost mythical old Russia of his childhood. Some read like ballads. The landscape is stark, the people and events tragic or comic on a grand scale. Still others deal with the present, often drawn in a grotesque, oblique, surrealist light, with echoing images and an extraordinary mingling of reality and irreality, mockery and grief. Others are jests, ribald inventions he called impious tales. In addition to his other qualities, Zamyatin had an unexpected streak of irrepressible gaiety and a great sense of fun. The same richness and diversity and a keen eye for the comic and grotesque infuse his plays. Many of his characters are marvelous caricatures. Wit, imagination, and always most meticulous craftsmanship are combined in much of his work with a profound sense of history and a prophetic vision. This is particularly true of We, a searing satire, among other things, on schematic, hence necessarily totalitarian society, written in 1920-21. We was not admitted to publication, read, as the custom frequently was in those years, at a meeting of the All-Russian Writers' Union in 1923. It elicited a new wave of violent attacks from party-line critics and writers. Zamyatin wrote this remarkably prophetic novel when the totalitarian future was just becoming discernible. Like all great satirists, he projected from present trends and intimations to an encompassing vision of the society to come. His method, as he defined it in We, was reductio ad finem, a method later applied with powerful effect by such master satirists as William Golding, The Inheritors, Lord of the Flies, and Anthony Burgess, The Wanting Seed, and A Clockwork Orange. Poet, mocker, laughter, he wrote, is the most devastating weapon. Heretical fighter for freedom and independence in art and life, Zamyatin was a consistent enemy of all canonized ideas, all coercion, all purveyors of compulsory salvation. He mercilessly attacked and ridiculed the emerging totalitarianism, its fawning mediocrities, its reign of brutality, its violation and destruction of all free and creative human spirit. He foresaw it all, the terror, the betrayals, the dehumanization, the ubiquitous guardians, the control of thought and action, the constant brainwashing, which resulted either in unquestioning automatons or in hypocrites who lied for the sake of survival, the demand that everyone worship the benefactor with his huge hand that literally liquidates, reduces all who dissent, all who passionately want to be themselves, to a puddle of clear water. He also foresaw the subjection of the arts. His hero boasts, "We have harnessed the once wild element of poetry. Today, poetry is no longer the idle, impudent whistling of a nightingale. Poetry is civic service. Poetry is useful." And not only must the people, numbers, in this apocalyptic state of ritualized totalitarianism attend the gala ceremony of extermination of every heretic by the benefactor, but a poet is obliged to recite an ode celebrating the wisdom and the great justice of the executioner. In style, too, We is a remarkable achievement, for Zamyatin had a perfect ear and a perfect taste. The language of our epic is sharp and rapid as a code, he wrote in 1923. In We, which is as carefully structured as a poem, the reader will find none of the slow singing richness of his provincial stories. none of the sly laughter of his impious tales. We, about the square state and the square men, is written in a style of utmost severity and discipline, a style in perfect harmony with the author's intention, with the totally controlled society he evokes, where emotion is banished, yet survives, where every moment is lived according to schedule in a glass-enclosed city of a glass houses and absolute straight lines, where even lovemaking is done on scheduled days and scheduled hours. The city of glass houses, that's Biosphere 2, where I just was at. Oh, I'm going to kind of scooch down. These rocks are a little hard. Move over. Maybe this one will be a little more comfortable. Okay. My hair's a little wet. Okay. Yeah, glass houses. But just as Zamyatin was much more than a keen political intellect, so we, within the astonishing discipline of its style, is much more than a political statement. It is a complex philosophical novel of endless subtlety and nuance, allusion and reflections. It is also profoundly moving human tragedy, and a study in the variety of human loves, passion, D 503, domination, I 330, jealousy, U, tenderness and gentle total giving of the self, O 90. And though the people are nameless numbers, they are never schematic figures. Each is an individual convincingly and movingly alive. Zamyatin's main concern in the novel is the problem of man in its multiple aspects. The relation of the individual to society and to other men, the conflict between the tempting safety of unfreedom and the will to free identity, and the fear and the lure of alienation, the rift between the rational and the irrational. We is also a study of a society that claims to be based on the purely rational and hence becomes deadly, dehumanizing, and absurd. Who are they, the hero asks, after he has seen the gentle, hairy creatures outside the wall that encloses the one state? The half we have lost, the feeling half, the irrational half that lives outside of schedules and straight lines. Yet even in the one state where nothing spontaneous is permitted, the state that is walled off from everything, unstructured and alive, life and humanity assert themselves. The hero, a builder and a mathematician who has been thoroughly shaped by his society, who never questions it, has atavistic, hairy hands. Seduced into violent and irrational passion, he makes a shocking discovery of an unsuspected and long-suppressed realm, the realm within of individual identity of self. Who am I? What am I like? He cries despairingly. In a supremely tragic comic scene, he visits a doctor seeking help against this terrifying malady, and the doctor gravely tells him he is seriously ill. He has developed a soul. Is it dangerous? He asks. Incurable, the doctor replies, but alas, it turns out to be curable in the end. The benefactor's men have found a remedy for individuality, for rebellion, for humanity, a simple operation to excise the seat of all infection, imagination, and reduce all citizens of the one state to grinning semi-morons. We is more multifaceted, less hopeless than Orwell's 1984, written more than 20 years later and directly influenced by Zamyatin's novel. Despite its tragic ending, We still carries a note of hope. Despite the rout of the rebellion, there is still fighting in the western parts of the city. Many numbers have escaped beyond the wall. Those who died were not destroyed as human beings. They died fighting and unsubmissive. And though the hero is reduced to an obedient automaton, certain that reason and static order will prevail, though the woman he loved so briefly and was forced into betraying dies, as do the poets and the rebels she led, the woman who loves him and who is gentle and tender is safe beyond the wall, and she will bear his child in freedom. And the wall itself has been proved vulnerable after all, and it has been breached, and surely will be breached again. I'm sitting on a wall. I'm sitting here on the Hohokam wall, this enclosure. over 1,000 years old. Glass houses and walls. Today is a day of glass houses and walls. In We, Zamyatin says, "This is where we are going. Stop while there is time." Throughout the poetry and the mockery, there is great warmth for Russia, for man, and profound grief over the particularly intense ordeals they were to suffer in our century of terror. So uncannily foreseen in this novel and so proudly faced. For Zamyatin himself, to such an extreme degree a victim of these ordeals, is remarkable in his utter lack of cynicism or bitterness. Anger, mockery, rebellion, but no self-pity and no bitterness. He seems to be saying to all the dogmatists, all who attempt to force life into a rigid mold, you will not, you cannot prevail. Man will not be destroyed. Zamyatin called We my most jesting and most serious work, and though it speaks on many levels and of many things, its political message is unmistakable. It is a warning and a challenge and a call to action. It is perhaps the fullest statement of Zamyatin's intellectual philosophy and emotional concerns. Significantly enough, the hounding of Zamyatin rose to a fever pitch in the late 1920s, when the present had become too uncomfortably like the prophecy, and when the benefactor and his machine had become too recognizable as living immediate realities. In 1929, full power in the literary field was placed into the hands of the RAP, the Russian Association of Proletarian Writers, which became the instrument for the extirpation of all that was still independent in Russian literature. And by campaigns of vilification, by pressures on journals and publishers, by the calls for police methods, it sought to bend everyone to the requisite line, service to the party. The RAP plunged into the role of executioner with gusto, and the results were quickly apparent. Many journals and publishing houses were closed, and there was a wave of suicides among writers and poets. Recantations became epidemic. Endless non-party writers, their spirits broken, publicly repented of their sins and came into the fold, repudiating and rewriting their own works. A particularly vicious campaign was launched against Zamyatin and Pilnyak. The latter was pilloried for the publication abroad of his novel Mahogany. We, which had been written almost 10 years earlier and never published in the Soviet Union, was used as the immediate pretext for Zamyatin's destruction. While its first translation into English in 1924 and Czech in 1927 had not provoked any noticeable response by Soviet authorities, its publication in 1927 in Volya Rossi, a Russian émigré journal published in Czechoslovakia without the author's knowledge or consent, was used 2 years later as a convenient excuse for bringing the full weight of official pressure upon its author. The matter was discussed at a meeting The matter was discussed at a meeting of the Writers' Union in the summer of 1929, when Zamyatin was away on a summer journey. One after another, his frightened and subservient colleagues rose to denounce him. Zamyatin replied with an indignant and courageous letter, resigning from the Union. "I find it impossible," he wrote, "to belong to a literary organization which takes part in the persecution of a fellow member." Pilnyak was unable to withstand the pressure and recanted. Zamyatin's former pupils and admirers, Ivanov, Katayev, Kavarin, sacrificed their talents to become hacks, manufacturing whatever was required in the shape and style demanded. Those with stronger backbones like Isaac Babel turned silent, and only isolated giants like Zamyatin and Bulgakov refused to submit. Denied access to publication, their plays withdrawn from the stage despite enormous popular success, and their books withdrawn from stores and libraries, they wrote to Stalin requesting permission to leave Russia. Both spoke of the ban on their work as a literary death sentence. Thanks to Gorky's intercession with Stalin, Zamyatin's request was surprisingly granted. He left Russia in 1931 and settled in Paris. His last years were a time of great loneliness and privation. He died of heart disease in 1937, his funeral attended by a mere handful of friends, for he had not accepted the émigré community as his own. To the end, he regarded himself as a Soviet writer, waiting merely, as he had written in his letter to Stalin, until it becomes possible in our country to serve great ideas without cringing before little men, until there is at least partial change in the prevailing view concerning the role of the literary artist. He was never to see that day. His death went unmentioned in the Soviet press. Like the rebellious poet of We, and like so many of the greatest Russian poets and writers of the 20th century, he was literally liquidated, reduced to non-being. His name was deleted from literary histories, and for decades he has been unknown in his homeland. And yet he lives. And his fellow victim, Bulgakov, said, "Manuscripts don't burn." He has been revived in the Western world, and We has been translated into more than 10 languages. Many of his stories, essays, and plays have been published abroad in Russian and also in English translation. Even in Soviet Russia, his name is beginning in recent years to crop up timidly in occasional memoirs. This is in the 1970s, this book. In occasional memoirs and occasional obscure essays on science fiction and utopian literature. It has even been restored to literary encyclopedias, of course, with the inevitable negative comment. And although his writings are still unavailable in Soviet Russia, they have undoubtedly reached some readers, writers, and scholars in underground ways, for his influence is clear in the thinking of dissidents of the 60s and 70s. Their fate, alas, is still much like Zamyatin's. Some are silent and others forced into exile. Like all major works of art, We lends itself to a multiplicity of interpretations. Numerous essays and analyses have been written on Zamyatin and on We, approaching it from various points of view and within various frameworks, as a study of modern man alienated from his natural self, as a Freudian charade, as a myth presenting man's dilemma in terms of archetypes and dream figures, as a religious parable with a strong Dostoevskian influence, and as one of the most significant modern anti-utopias, and so on. We is all of these and more. It is one of the great tragic novels of our time. But let the book speak for itself. The discerning reader will find it in far more than can be suggested in an introduction. Mira Ginsburg. So she wrote the introduction. And then acknowledgments. We was first published in Russian in book form in 1952 by the Chekhov Publishing House in New York. I wish to express my gratitude to the National Board of Young Men's Christian Association's present owner of legal rights to books published by Chekhov Publishing for permission to translate We into English. Thanks are also due to the University of Chicago Press for permission to quote from A Soviet Heretic, Essays by Yevgeny Zamyatin, published in 1970. First entry. Topics. A proclamation. The wisest of lines, a poem. I shall simply copy word for word the proclamation that appeared today in the One State Gazette. The building of the integral will be completed in 120 days. The great historic hour when the first integral will soar into cosmic space is drawing near. 1,000 years ago, your heroic ancestors subdued the entire terrestrial globe to the power of the one state. The space stuff is really important too here for Tucson, aerospace and defense, and integrals. I have a hard time saying that. Yours will be a still more glorious feat. You will integrate the infinite equation of the universe with the aid of the fire-breathing electric glass integral. You will subjugate the unknown beings on other planets who may still be living in the primitive condition of freedom to the beneficent yoke of reason. And if they fail to understand that we bring them mathematically infallible happiness, it will be our duty to compel them to be happy. But before resorting to arms, we shall try the power of words. In the name of the benefactor, therefore, we proclaim to all the numbers of the one state. Everyone who feels capable of doing so must compose tracts, odes, manifestos, poems, or other works extolling the beauty and the grandeur of the one state. This will be the first cargo to be carried by the integral. Long live the one state. Long live the numbers. Long live the benefactor. I write this and I feel my cheeks are burning. Yes, to integrate the grandiose cosmic equation. Yes, to unbend the wild primitive curve and straighten it to a tangent, an asymptote, a straight line. For the line of the one state is the straightest line, the great, divine, exact, wise, straight line, the wisest of all the lines. I, D 503, builder of the integral, am only one of the mathematicians of the one state. My pen, accustomed to figures, does not know how to create the music of assonances and rhymes. I shall merely attempt to record what I see and think, or to be more exact, what we think, precisely so we, and let this be we, the title of my record. But since this record will be a derivative of our life, of the mathematically perfect life of the one state, will it not be of itself, regardless of my will or skill, a poem? It will. I believe. I know it. I write this and my cheeks are burning. This must be similar to what a woman feels when she first senses within herself the pulse of a new, still tiny, still blind little human being. It is I, and at the same time not I, and for many long months it will be necessary to nourish it with my own life and my own blood, and then tear it painfully from myself and lay it at the feet of the one state. But I am ready, like every one, or almost every one of us. I am ready. And this is second entry, topics, ballet and square harmony. Spring. From beyond the green wall, from the wild invisible plains, the wind brings yellow honey pollen of some unknown flowers. The sweet pollen dries your lips, and every minute you pass your tongue over them. The lips of all the women you see must be sweet, of the men too, of course. This interferes to some extent with the flow of logical thought. But the sky, blue, unblemished by a single cloud. How wild the tastes of the ancients whose poets could be inspired by those absurd, disorderly, stupidly tumbling piles of vapor. I love, I am certain I can safely say we love, only such a sterile, immaculate sky. On days like this, the whole world is cast of the same impregnable, eternal glass as the green wall of all of our buildings. On days like this, you can see the bluest depth of things, their hitherto unknown, astonishing equations. You see them, even the most familiar everyday objects. Take, for instance, this. In the morning, I was at the dock where the integral was being built, and suddenly I saw the lathes, the regulator spheres rotating with closed eyes, utterly oblivious of all, the cranks flashing, swinging left and right, the balance beam proudly swaying its shoulders, the bit of the slotting machine dancing up and down in time to unheard music, and suddenly I saw the whole beauty of this grandiose mechanical ballet flooded with pale blue sunlight. And then to myself, why is this beautiful? Why is this dance beautiful? Answer, because it is unfree motion. Because the whole profound meaning of this dance lies precisely in absolute aesthetic subordination, in ideal unfreedom. And if it is true that our forebears abandoned themselves to dance at the most exalted moments of their lives, religious mysteries and military parades, it means only one thing. The instinct of unfreedom is organically inherent in man from time immemorial, and we in our present life are only consciously. I will have to finish later, the annunciator clicked. I looked up. 090, of course. In half a minute, she'll be here for our daily walk. Dear O, it always seems to me like she looks exactly like her name, about 10 centimeters shorter than the maternal norm, and therefore carved in the round, all of her, with that pink O, her mouth open to meet every word I say, and also that round plump fold on her wrist like a baby's. When she came in, the flywheel of logic was still humming at full swing within me, and I began, by sheer force of inertia, to speak to her about the formula I had just established, which encompassed everything, dance, machines, and all of us. Marvelous, isn't it? I asked. Yes, marvelous, 090 smiled rosily at me. It's spring. Well, wouldn't you know, spring. She talks about spring. Women. I fell silent. Downstairs, the avenue was full. In such weather, the afternoon personal hour is used for an additional walk. As always, the music plant played the March of the One State with all its trumpets, and the numbers walked in even ranks, four abreast, ecstatically stepping in time to the music. Hundreds, thousands of numbers in pale blue unifs, with golden badges on their breasts, bearing the state number of each man and woman. Hello. And I, the four of us, but one of the innumerable waves in the mighty stream, and on my left 090, if this were being written by one of my hairy ancestors 1,000 years ago, he probably would have described her by that funny word, mine. On my right, two numbers I did not know, male and female. Blessedly blue sky, tiny baby suns in every badge face, unshadowed by the insanity of thought. Rays. Do you understand that? Everything is made of some single, radiant, smiling substance. And the brass rhythms, ta-ta-tam, like brass stairs gleaming in the sun, and every step taking you higher and higher into the dizzying blue. And again, at this morning at the dock, I saw everything as though for the first time in my life. The straight, immutable streets, the glittering glass of the pavements, the divine parallel pipades of the transparent houses, the square harmony of the gray-blue ranks. And I felt it was not the generations before me, but I who had conquered the old God and the old life. It was I who had created all of this, and I was like a tower. I dared not move an elbow lest walls, cupolas, machines tumble in fragments around me. And then a leap across the centuries from plus to minus, I remembered, evidently an association by contrast. I suddenly remembered a picture I had seen in a museum. One of their avenues out of the 20th century, dazzlingly motley, a teeming crush of people, all wheels and animals and posters and trees and colors and birds, and they say that this had to have really existed. I mean, could exist. It seemed so incredible, so preposterous, that I could not contain myself, and I burst out laughing. And immediately there was an echo laughter on my right, and I turned, a flash of white, extraordinarily white and sharp teeth, an unfamiliar female face. "Forgive me," she said, "but you looked at everything around you with such an inspired air, like some mythical god on the seventh day of creation. It seems to me that you are sure that even I was created by you and by no one else. I am very flattered." All of this without a smile. I would even say, with a certain deference. Perhaps she knew that I am the builder of the integral. But in the eyes or in the eyebrows, I could not tell. There was a certain strange, irritating X, which I could not capture. I could not define in figures. For some odd reason, I felt embarrassed and tried, in a rather stumbling manner, to explain my laughter to her logically. "It is entirely clear," I said, that this contrast, this impassable abyss between present and past. But why impassable? What white teeth. A bridge can be thrown across an abyss. Just think, drums, battalions, ranks, all this has to have also existed in the past, and consequently... "Oh, but of course," I cried. Well, what an astonishing coincidence of ideas. She spoke almost on my own words, the words I had written down before our walk. "You understand, even ideas, and this is because no one is one, but one of. We are so alike." She. "Are you sure?" I saw her eyebrows raised to her temples at a sharp angle, like the pointed horns of an X, and again I was confused. I glanced right and left. On my right, she, slender, sharp, stubbornly pliant, like a whip. I 330. I could remember her number now. And on my left, altogether different, all curves with that childish fold on her wrist, and at the other end of the row a male number, I don't know, strange, doubly bent somehow, like the letter S. All of us so different. That one on the right, I 330, seems to have intercepted my flustered glance, and with a sigh she said, "Yes, alas." Actually, this alas was entirely appropriate, but again, there was something in her face or in her voice, and with a sharpness unusual for me, I said, "No reason for alas. Science progresses, and it is obvious that, if not now, then in 50 or 100 years. Even everyone's noses." "Yes," I shouted, "noses! If there is any ground for envy, no matter what it is, if I have a button nose and another... Oh, your nose is classical, as they used to say in olden times, but your hands... No, let's see your hands. Oh, I detest to have anyone look at my hands, all hairy and shaggy. A stupid atavism." I held out my hand and said indifferently as I could, "An ape's hands." And she glanced at my hands and at my face. A most interesting conjunction. She weighed me with her eyes on a scale, and the horns flicked again in the corners of her eyebrows. "He is registered with me." 90's lips opened rosily, eager with joy. I wish she had kept silent. This was altogether out of place. Generally, this dear how shall I put it? Her tongue is wrongly timed. The speed of the tongue should always be some seconds behind the speed of thought, but certainly not the other way around. At the end of the avenue, the bell on the accumulator tower was loudly striking 17. The personal hour was over. I 330 was leaving with the S-shaped male member. His face was somehow inspired respect. And now it seemed familiar. I must have met him somewhere, but where? In parting, I 330 said with another of her X-smiles, "Come to Auditorium 112 at the day after tomorrow." I shrugged. Well, if I am assigned to that auditorium. And she said with an odd certainty, oh, you will be. And the woman affected me as unpleasantly as an irrational member that had somehow slipped into an equation, and I was glad to remain for at least a few moments alone with dear O. Hand in hand, we crossed 4 lines of avenues, and at the corner, she had to turn right, and I left. I'd like so much to come to you today and let down my blinds. Today, right now. O timidly raised her round blue crystal eyes to me. How funny she is. What could I say to her? She had come to me only the day before, and she knew me as well as I did that our next sexual day was the day after tomorrow. It was simply a case of her usual words ahead of thought, like the occasional and sometimes damaging premature supply of a spark to a motor. Before we parted, I kissed her lovely blue eyes, unshadowed by a single cloud, 3 times. The third entry. Topics: coat wall tables. I have just looked over what I have written yesterday, and I see that I did not express myself clearly enough. Of course, it is all entirely clear to any of us, but perhaps you, the unknown readers to whom the integral will bring my notes, have reached only that page in the great book of civilization that our ancestors read some 900 years ago. Perhaps you do not know even about such elementary things as the table of hours, the personal hour, the maternity norm, the green wall, and the benefactor. I mean, it seems to me ridiculous, yet very difficult to speak about all of this. It's as if a writer has to say the 20th century had to explain in his novel the meaning of coat or apartment or wife. Yet, if his novel were to be translated for savages, I mean, how could he avoid explaining what coat meant? I am certain that a savage would look at coat and wonder, what is it for? It's only a hindrance. It seems to me that your response may be exactly the same when I tell you that none of us has been beyond the green wall since the 200 Years' War. But my dear readers, a man must think, at least a little, it helps. After all, it is clear that the entire history of mankind, insofar as we know it, is the history of transition from nomadic to increasingly settled forms of existence. And does it not follow that the most settled form, ours, is at the same time the most perfect, ours? People rushed about from one end of the earth to the other only in prehistoric times when there were nations and wars and commerce and discoveries of all sorts of Americas. But who needs that now? I mean, what for? I admit, the habit of such a settled existence was not achieved easily, or all at once. During the 200 Years' War, when all the roads fell into ruin and were overgrown with grass, it must at first have seemed extremely inconvenient to live in cities, cut off from one another by green jungles. But what of it? I mean, after a man's tail dropped off, it must have been quite difficult for him to learn to drive off the flies without its aid. In the beginning, he undoubtedly missed his tail, but now, can you imagine yourself with a tail? Or can you imagine yourself in the street naked, without a coat? For you may still be trotting about in coats. And so it is with me. I cannot imagine a city that is not clad in a green wall. I cannot imagine a life that is not regulated by the figures of our table. The table. At this very moment, from the wall in my room, its purple figures on a field of gold stare tenderly and sternly into my eyes. Involuntarily, my mind turns to what the ancients called an icon, and I long to compose poems or prayers, which are the same thing. Oh, why am I not a poet to render fitting praise to the table, the heart and pulse of the one state? As school children, we all read, perhaps you have too, that the greatest literary monument to have come down to us from the ancient days, the railway guide. But set it aside with our table, side by side in our table, and it will be as graphite next to a diamond. Both consist of the same element, carbon, yet how eternal, how transparent is the diamond, and how it gleams, whose breath will fail to quicken as he rushes clattering along the pages of the railway guide. But our table of hours, why, it transforms each one of us into a figure of steel, a six-wheeled hero of a mighty epic poem, every morning with six-wheeled precision at the same hour, at the same moment. We, millions of us, get up as one, and at the same hour, in a million-headed unison, we start work. In a million-headed unison, we end it. And fused into a single million-handed body, at the same second designated by the table, we lift our spoons to our mouths, and at the same second we come out for our walk to go to the auditorium, go to the hall for tailor exercises, and fall asleep. I shall be entirely frank. Even when we have not yet found absolute precise solution to the problem of happiness. Twice a day, from 16 to 17 and from 21 to 22, the single mighty organism breaks up into separate cells.
And these are the personal hours designated by the table. In these hours, you will see modestly lowered shades in the rooms of some, and others will walk with measured tread along the avenue, as though climbing the brass stairs of the march. Still others, like myself, are at their desks, but I am confident, and you may call me an idealist and a dreamer, I am confident that sooner or later we shall fit these personal hours as well into the general formula. Someday, these 86,400 seconds will also be entered into the table of hours. I have read and heard many incredible things about those times when people still lived in a free, in other words, unorganized, savage condition. But most incredible of all, it seems to me, is that the state authority of that time, no matter how rudimentary, could allow men to live without anything like our without anything like our table, without obligatory walks, without exact regulation of mealtimes, getting up and going to bed whenever they felt like it. Some historians even say that in those times the street lights burned all night and that people walked and drove around in the streets at all hours of the night. Try as I may, I cannot understand it. After all, no matter how limited their intelligence, they should have understood that such a way of life was truly mass murder, even if slow murder. The state, humaneness, forbade the killing of a single individual, but not the partial killing of millions day by day. To kill one individual, that is, to diminish the total sum of human lives by 50 years, was criminal. But to diminish the sum of human lives by 50 million years was not considered criminal. Isn't that absurd? Today, any 10-year-old will solve this mathematical moral problem in half a minute. They, with all their Kants taken together, could not solve it because it never occurred to any of the Kants to build a system of scientific ethics, in other words, ethics based on subtraction, addition, division, and multiplication. And wasn't it absurd that the state, it dared to call itself a state, could leave sexual life without any semblance of control? I mean, as often, as much as anyone might wish, I mean, totally unscientific, like animals, and blindly, like animals, they bore their young. I mean, isn't it ridiculous to know agriculture, poultry breeding, fish breeding? We have exact information that they knew all of this, yet fail to go on to the ultimate step of this logical ladder, child breeding, fail to establish such a thing as our maternal and paternal norms. It is so absurd, so unbelievable that I am afraid, as I write this, that you, my unknown readers, will think me a malicious joker. I am afraid you may decide that I am merely trying to mock you, telling you utter nonsense with a straight face. But to begin with, I am incapable of jokes, for every joke contains a lie as implicit function. Secondly, our one-state science asserts that this was how the ancients lived, and that our state science never errs. Besides, where would state logic have come from at a time when men were living in the condition of freedom, the condition of animals, apes, the herd? What could have been expected of them when even in our time the wild ape-like echo still occasionally rises from somewhere below, some shaggy depths? Fortunately, only on rare occasions. Fortunately, there are only breakdowns of minor parts which can easily be repaired without halting the eternal grandiose movement of the entire machine. And to expel the warped bolt, we have skilled, heavy hand of the benefactor and the experienced eyes of the guardians. And, by the way, I've just remembered, that number I saw yesterday bent like an S. I think I've seen him coming out of the office of the guardians. And now I understand that instinctive feeling of respect I had for him, and the sense of awkwardness when the strange I-330 spoke before him. I must confess that this I-330, well, the bell for bedtime, it is past 22 until tomorrow. I think I'll do one more. Fourth entry. Topics: a savage with a barometer, epilepsy, and if. Until now, everything in life was clear to me. No wonder I seem to have a predilection for the very word clear, yet today I cannot understand it. First, I was indeed assigned to Auditorium 112, as she had told me, although the probability was 1,500 over 10 million, or 3 over 20,000, 1,500 being the number of auditoriums and 10 million being the number of numbers, and second. But let me tell it in order as it happened. The auditorium, an enormous sun-drenched hemisphere of massive glass, circular rows of nobly spherical and smooth-shaven heads, with a slightly palpitating heart, I looked around me. I think I was searching for the sight of a rosy crescent, O's sweet lips, over the blue waves of Eunice. A flash of someone's extraordinarily white, sharp teeth, like, no, but it wasn't that. O was to come at me at 21 that evening. It was entirely natural for me to wish to see her there. The bell rang, and we stood up and sang the hymn of the one state. And then from the stage, the voice of the phono lecturer, glittering with its golden loudspeaker and wit. Respected numbers! Archaeologists have recently dug up a certain 20th century book in which the ironic author tells the story of a savage and a barometer. The savage noticed that every time the barometer indicated rain, it actually rained. And since he wanted it to rain, he picked out exactly enough mercury from the column to leave it at rain. On the screen, a savage dressed in feathers, picking out the mercury, laughter. You are laughing, but does it not seem to you that the European of that period was even more ridiculous? Like the savage, the European wanted rain, rain with a capital letter, algebraic rain, but all he did was stand before the barometer like a limp, wet hen. The savage at least had more courage and energy and logic, if only primitive logic. He had been able to discover that there was a connection between effect and cause. Picking out the mercury, he was able to take the first step on that great road along which, at this point, I repeat, I write these notes without concealing anything. At this point, I became as though impermeable to the vitalizing stream that flowed from the loudspeakers, and I was suddenly overcome by the feeling I had come there for nothing. Why, for nothing, and how could I not have come since I had been assigned there? Everything seemed empty, nothing but mere husks, and when by the dint of considerable effort I managed to switch on my attention again, the phono lecturer had already gone on to his main topic, our music, mathematical composition, the mathematician as the cause, music as the effect. He was describing the recently devised musicometer. Simply by turning this handle, any of you can produce up to 3 sonatas an hour. Yet think how much effort this had cost your forebears. They were able to create only by whipping themselves up into fits of inspiration, an unknown form of epilepsy. And here you have a most amusing illustration of what they produced. Scriabin, the 20th century, they called this black box. A curtain parted on the stage revealing their most ancient instrument. A grand, a royal instrument, which only shows once more to what extent their entire music... And then I lost the thread again. Perhaps because, well, yes, I will be frank, because 3:30, came out to the royal box. I suppose I was simply startled by her sudden appearance on the stage. She wore the fantastic costume of the ancient epoch, a closely fitting black dress which sharply emphasized the whiteness of her bare shoulders and breast, with that warm shadow stirring her breast between, and the dazzling, almost angry teeth. A smile, a bite to us below, and then she sat down and began to play, something savage, spasmodic, variegated like their whole life at that moment, not a trace of the rational, mechanical method. And of course, all of those around me were right. I mean, they all laughed, except for a few, but why was it that I too... Yes, epilepsy, a sickness of the spirit, pain, slow, sweet pain, a bite, and then you want it still deeper and more painful, and then slowly the sun, not ours, not that bluish crystal even glow through the glass bricks, no, a wild, rushing, scorching sun, and off with all your clothing, tear everything to shreds, and the number next to me glanced to the left, at me and snorted. Somehow a vivid memory remains. A tiny bubble of saliva blew out on his lips and burst, and the bubble sobered me, and I was myself again. Like all the others, I now heard only senseless, hurried clattering. I laughed. There was a feeling of relief. Everything was simple. The clever phono lecturer had given us too vivid a picture of what primitive age. That was all. With what enjoyment I listened afterward to our present music. It was demonstrated at the end for contrast. The crystalline chromatic measures of converging and diverging infant series and the synthesizing chords of Taylor and McLaurin for formulas. The full-toned square heavy tempos of Pythagoras trousers. The sad melodies of attenuating vibrations. Vivid beats alternating with Fraunhofer lines of pauses like the spectroscopic analysis of planets. What grandeur, what imperishable logic, and how pathetic the capricious music of the ancients, governed by nothing but wild fantasy. As usual, we walked out through the wide doors of the auditorium in orderly ranks, 4 abreast. The familiar doubly bent figure flashed past, and I bowed respectfully. O was to come in an hour, and I felt pleasantly and beneficially excited. At home, I stepped hurriedly into the office, handed in my pink coupon, and received the certificate permitting me to lower the shades. This right is granted only on sexual days. At all other times, we live behind our transparent walls that seem woven of gleaming air. We are always visible, always washed in light. We have nothing to conceal from one another. Besides, this makes much easier the difficult and noble task of the guardians. For who knows what might happen otherwise? Perhaps it was precisely those strange, opaque dwellings of the ancients that gave rise to their paltry cage psychology. My sick home is my castle. What an ideal. At 22, I lowered the shades, and at that same moment, O entered, slightly out of breath. She held up to me her pink lips and her pink coupon, and I tore off the stub and could not tear myself away from her pink mouth until the very last second. 22:15. Afterwards, I showed her my notes, and I spoke. Square, the cube, the straight line, and she listened with such enchanting pink attention, and suddenly a tear dropped from the blue eyes, and then a second, a third, right on the open page, page 7, and the ink ran. Now I shall have to copy the page. Darling Dee, if only you, if what? If her old song again about a child, or perhaps something new about the other one, but this would be too absurd. And the last one, I'll do the 5th entry. Topic: square, the rulers of the world, and a pleasantly useful function. Again, it's all wrong. Again, I speak to you, my unknown reader, as though, let us say you were my old friend R13, the poet, the one with the negroid lips. Everyone knows him, but you are on the moon, on Venus, Mars, Mercury. I mean, who knows where you are or who you are? Now think of a square, a living, beautiful square, and imagine that it must tell you about itself, about its life. And you understand a square would scarcely ever think of telling you all its 4 angles are equal. This has become so natural, so ordinary, that it's simply no longer consciously aware. And so with me, I find myself continually in this square's position. I mean, take the pink coupons, for example, and all the rest that goes with them. I mean, to me, this is as natural as the equality of the 4 angles is to the square. But to you, it may be more of a mystery than Newton's binomial theorem. Well, one of the ancient sages said a clever thing, accidentally, of course: love and hunger rule the world. Ergo, to conquer the world, man must conquer its rulers. Our forebears succeeded at heavy cost in conquering hunger. I am speaking of the great 200 Years' War, the war between the city and the village. The primitive peasants, prompted perhaps by religious prejudice, stubbornly clinging to their bread. But in the year 35, before the founding of the one state, our present food, a petroleum product, was developed. True, only 0.2% of the Earth's population survived the war, but, cleansed of its millennial filth, how radiant the face of the Earth had become. And those 2 tenths survived to taste the heights of bliss in the shining palace of the one state. It is not clear, however, that bliss and envy are the numerator and denominator of the fraction called happiness. And what sense would there be in the countless sacrifices of the 200 Years' War if reasons for envy still remained in our life? Yet they did remain, for there were still button noses and classical ones. Our conversation during the walk. There were still some whose love was sought by many, and those whose love was sought by none. Naturally, having conquered hunger, algebraically, by the sum total of external welfare, the one state launched its attack against the other ruler of the world, love. And finally, this elemental force was also subjugated. In other words, organized and reduced to mathematical order. About 300 years ago, our historic lex sexualis was proclaimed. Each number has a right to any other number as to a sexual commodity. And since then, it has been only a matter of technology. You are carefully examined in the laboratories of the sexual department. The exact content of sexual hormones in your blood is determined, and you are provided with an appropriate table of sexual days. And after that, you declare that on your sexual days you wish to use number so-and-so, and you receive your book of coupons, pink, and that is all. And clearly this leaves no possible reason for envy. The denominator of happiness, the happiness fraction, is reduced to 0, and the fraction is transformed into a magnificent infinity. And so what to the ancients was the source of innumerable stupid tragedy has been reduced to a harmonious, pleasant, and useful function of the organism, a function like sleep, physical labor, the consumption of food, defecation, and so on. Hence, you see how the great power of logic purifies everything it touches. Oh, if only you, my dear readers, could come to know this divine power, if you too would learn to follow it to the end. How strange. I have written today about the loftiest peaks of human history, and I have breathed all this time the purest mountain air of thought. Yet within me everything is somehow cloudy, cobwebby, shadowy by the cross of a strange 4-pawed X. Or is it my own shaggy paws? And all because they have been so long before my eyes. I dislike to talk about them. I dislike them. They are a relic of a savage epoch. Can it be that somewhere within me there is really, and I wanted to cross it all out because it is outside the outlined topics for this entry. And then I decided I would leave it, leave my notes like the most sensitive seismograph, record the curve of even the most insignificant vibrations of my brain, for it is precisely such vibrations that are sometimes the forewarning of. But this is entirely absurd. This really should be stricken out. We have channeled all elemental forces, and there can be no catastrophes. And now all is entirely clear to me. The odd feeling within me is simply the result of that same square position that I have described before. And the troubling X is not within me. It cannot be. It is simply my fear that some X may remain in you, my unknown readers. But I am confident that you will not judge me too severely. I am confident that you will understand that it is far more difficult for me to write than it has been for any other author in the history of mankind. Some wrote for their contemporaries, others for their descendants, but no one has ever written for ancestors or for beings similar to his primitive, remote ancestors. All right, so that's the end of chapter 5, and I think I will call that a conclusion for now. But I also think this is such a beautiful setting that as I walk out this trail, I'm just going to let you walk with me, and you can see how beautiful this is and such a contrast to the story. So I'm going to turn this off now, and then we'll start again. All right, so I'm just going to do a little panorama so you can see where I was sitting. Up that direction is where Biosphere 2 is, an oracle. And these are the old ancient walls that I was sitting on. And I'll read the wayside here. It was a prehistoric walled village of the Hohokam people. And those stones are what's left. And so we'll see a few other artifacts. And it's this beautiful cloudy day. You can see it's very atmospheric. It's very moody. I love it. So we'll just There was a wildfire here last year, so you can see some of the burned. There's some more stones from the village. And craggy peaks. Ruins. My friend says they've been in a drought for a long time, for like 20 years. So it's quite something to be here on a rainy day, especially with the remnants of the wildfires. Mount Lemon is somewhere off in the distance, somewhere in this range. I might try to go there before I go home. Might even be a little snow. My friend says there's like many ecosystems. So this is the compound, the wall, encircled the village. And the village is in this location because there are two water sources. Well, they're dried up now, but historically it was the confluence of two different water sources. So they were able to grow crops along the and have, water. And there's an amazing number of birds here. So many birds. I've done a number of hikes and I haven't seen that many birds, but maybe they like it cool. On the way out of Biosphere 2, I actually had a roadrunner run across my path, which is pretty amazing, and some maybe quail. Little birds with little bobby things on their head. I think these are so beautiful. fruits here and the colors. Some of them turn purple, so it goes from this gray-green to the purple. It's really beautiful. But I guess I didn't really know about succulents and fire, but you can see even they burned, and some of the, the prickly pear. I think this wayside says that we're up on this little rise, and it's a trash pile from many, many centuries of use. You can kind of see Tucson in the distance there. It's pretty built up. We're not really very far out of town. This is maybe just a half an hour outside of the city. I think coming up around the corner, well, there's an area of, even before the Hohokam, there were an older people that had, I guess the Hohokam had adobe built dwellings, but these were pit houses with wood and then brush and then mud applied. So those are the earlier. There you can see how it sort of goes purple. That's really incredible color, actually. I don't know. I'm an East Coaster, so if you guys on the West Coast, maybe this is all totally normal, but I think it's quite spectacular. So this is the wayside that says that there is a pit house village that was much earlier, and then around the corner here is ball courts that were of the kind, I guess, that you would see in Mexico with the Aztec. It said at one point they would have walls, and so it was sort of a pit, and I guess like handball courts, and that they had excavated two of these courts, and I'm assuming where the grasses are. Maybe it's coming up. But the grass is quite lovely. And there's a kind of cactus here that has these little red buds on them. Almost they remind me of rose hips. And I'm going to see if I can get a little bit closer, a better view of them. But it's pretty interesting. The hills are so high, but they're just all shrouded in clouds today. And there's the saguaro cactus in the distance. It's hard to get a sense of scale. They're so huge. There's one that sort of fell over, so I'm going to walk by and we'll pay our respects. But this is the area where they're talking about the ball courts. The Hohokam, I guess, we're doing the ball courts. It says ball courts were found in large villages throughout southern Arizona. This ruin is one of just a few that have two courts. There were large oval-shaped depressions surrounded by earthen berms or piled rocks ranging from 60 to 200 feet in length, and the berms were sometimes 10 feet high. This one is about 80 feet long, and it is similar to courts in Mexico and Central America with ritual ball gaming. Most courts in the Tucson area date from 750 to 1050 AD. And it fostered cooperation and resolving conflict. And I don't know, it's pretty interesting in the context because, we're dealing with a lot of ideals about gamification, right? And civic engagement and tokenization. Like, I wonder, the legacy of that. So I'm assuming it's somewhere in here. You don't see the big berms, but must have done excavation, the ball courts. And I do want to walk around to this saguaro that has, I didn't have a good sense being an East Coaster, just the structure. Oh, here are these beautiful, with these tiny little, can you sort of see? I don't know if it's getting clear. Yeah, they remind me of rose hips, but it's on a cactus.
And the color is really spectacular. Really neat. So, they're subtle. The colors it's subtle, but I'm really appreciating it. So, yeah, so this is something. I mean, I don't know if maybe this cactus got hit by lightning or if this is the result of what happened with the fire. But it just, you have this sort of compassion for the being that is this amazing living being here. And, you can see how it's all put together. And it's interesting because, we're talking about the geometry and the integrals. This almost looks like metal with rivets. I'm gonna head down to the car, but hopefully this was interesting.